Across Canada, there are thousands of names, written in faded ink, stored in police archives, and whispered through generations, each belonging to someone whose story ended without answers. These are the cold cases, investigations that began with urgency and hope, but slowly slipped into silence as leads ran dry and evidence grew old. For families, the waiting never ends. They live in a space between grief and uncertainty, holding on to the idea that one day someone will reopen the file, retest a sample, or find the missing piece that was overlooked the first time. Communities remember too. A neighbor, a classmate, a face from an old newspaper clipping, reminders that time can dull the details, but never the impact. Today, we look at a series of Canadian cold cases once thought unsolvable, reopened, re-examined, and finally resolved through the power of modern DNA and genetic genealogy. Before we start, let me know where you are watching from, and what are you currently doing? Waiting to fall asleep? Working? Daily chores or something else? And subscribe for more real stories from Canada's hidden corners. Sharron Prior, March 29, 1975. Montreal, Quebec. Solved, 2023. It was a cool Saturday evening in March 1975 when 16-year-old Sharron Prior told her mother she was heading out to meet friends at a pizzeria just a few blocks away in Montreal's Pointe Saint-Charles neighborhood. She was a confident, outgoing teen, loved by her classmates, known for her bright smile and kind heart. But that short walk, barely a 10-minute trip, would mark the last time her family ever saw her alive. When Sharron didn't return that night, panic spread quickly. Her mother, Yvonne, searched the streets and called police. By dawn, posters were going up across the neighborhood. Dozens of volunteers joined in. They combed alleys, wooded lots, and abandoned buildings, but no trace of the teenager appeared. For days, Montreal police treated it as a missing person case, hoping she had run away or been taken in by friends. That hope collapsed when on April 1, 1975, Sharron's body was discovered in a wooded area in Longueuil, across the river from where she lived. The scene made it clear that she had been abducted and violently attacked. Her clothes were torn, and tire impressions nearby suggested she'd been transported in a vehicle. It was immediately classified as a homicide. Detectives interviewed dozens of local men and known offenders, collected blood and hair samples, and followed leads across the province. But forensic science in the 1970s had severe limits. DNA profiling didn't yet exist, and evidence like hair or fibers could only narrow possibilities, not confirm identities. One early suspect, an American man named Franklin Romine, originally from West Virginia, was mentioned in local rumors, but police had nothing solid. Romine was living in Montreal at the time, had a criminal history, and fled Canada shortly after the killing. He died in 1982, and the file soon went old. Sharron's mother refused to let her daughter's case fade. Every few years, she wrote letters to the police chief and local newspapers asking if anything new had been tested. Detectives preserved the physical evidence, including semen samples and clothing, through multiple transfers between the Montreal Police and Longueuil Police Departments, hoping that one day technology would catch up. By the 2000s, with the rise of DNA profiling and later genetic genealogy, investigators began revisiting historic unsolved homicides across Canada. In 2021, Longueuil Police, working with U.S. and Canadian forensic experts, managed to extract a usable DNA profile from the preserved samples. They uploaded the profile to a public genealogical database under legal and ethical oversight, and within months, a partial family match pointed south, to the Romine family of West Virginia. Detectives coordinated with U.S. authorities, locating relatives of Franklin Romine, who had died decades earlier. To confirm the match, a U.S. court granted permission to exhume Romine's remains in West Virginia. The process was delicate, both legally and emotionally, but when the results returned in April 2023, they were irrefutable. Romine's DNA was a complete match to the DNA recovered from Sharron's body in 1975. In May 2023, the Longueuil Police Service publicly announced that the case of Sharron Prior was solved. Nearly 48 years after her disappearance, the man responsible was finally identified. Though Romine could never face trial, police confirmed that he had a history of violent crimes in both Canada and the U.S., fitting the behavioral pattern investigators long suspected. At a press conference, Sharron's mother, now in her 80s, stood surrounded by her remaining family. "We finally have peace," she said softly. "We never gave up, and neither did they." A public vigil followed at the site where Sharron was last seen. Neighbors and community members placed flowers under the old brick archway near the pizzeria, the same path she walked on that March evening in 1975. The resolution of the Sharron Prior case stands as one of Canada's most poignant examples of how persistence and modern science can outlast time itself. It took almost half a century, spanning multiple police departments, evolving DNA technologies, and cross-border collaboration. But the outcome proved what her family had believed all along. Someone, somewhere knew. And now, after 48 years, everyone does. Erin Gilmour Susan Tice, 1983, Toronto, Ontario, guilty, 2023. In the summer of 1983, downtown Toronto was shaken by two eerily similar tragedies. Within just 4 months, two women, both kind, intelligent, and deeply respected in their communities, were found murdered in their own homes. First was Susan Tice, a 45-year-old social worker and mother of 4, discovered on August 17, 1983, inside her Gray Street residence. Police confirmed that she had been attacked and her life taken in what they called a targeted, violent incident. The city mourned quietly, but before anyone could process what had happened, another name would make headlines. On December 20, 1983, Erin Gilmour, a 22-year-old fashion designer and daughter of philanthropist David Gilmour, was found murdered in her Yorkville apartment. The similarities between the two crimes were impossible to ignore. Both victims discovered in their own residences, both attacked, and no sign of forced entry. Toronto police quickly suspected a serial offender, but in 1983 there was no DNA database, and investigative technology was still limited. Detectives worked for years, interviewing hundreds of people, checking fingerprints and fibers, but every promising lead went cold. By the 1990s, advances in forensic science allowed investigators to extract DNA profiles from preserved evidence. When they compared samples from both cases, they discovered something chilling. The same unknown male DNA profile appeared in both scenes. It confirmed the same man was responsible for both murders. It was a breakthrough that still led nowhere. The profile didn't match anyone in the National DNA Databank, which had just begun collecting offender samples. Detectives released composite sketches and appealed to the public, but the suspect remained unidentified. Erin's brother, Sean Gilmour, and Susan's children continued to speak to the media, urging police not to give up. Each anniversary brought renewed appeals, but by 2018, 35 years later, the investigation seemed frozen in time. Everything changed in November 2022. Using investigative genetic genealogy, IgG, Toronto police uploaded the suspect's DNA profile to a public genealogy database with the help of forensic experts. Within months, the results pointed to a single family line in northern Ontario. After extensive cross-referencing of records and family trees, investigators identified Joseph George Sutherland, a 61-year-old man living in Moosonee, Ontario, a remote community near James Bay. On November 24, 2022, officers from the Toronto Police Homicide Unit, with OPP assistance, arrested Sutherland at his residence. He was charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder. The arrest made national headlines. It had been nearly 40 years since the crimes. In October 2023, Sutherland pleaded guilty to 2 counts of second-degree murder, avoiding a lengthy trial. During sentencing, prosecutors revealed that Sutherland had been just 22 at the time of the killings and had lived a quiet life for decades afterward, with no further known violent offenses. Justice Maureen Forrestal sentenced him to life imprisonment, with no chance of parole for 21 years, meaning Sutherland will remain behind bars well into his 80s. At the hearing, Family members of both women read emotional victim impact statements. "For 40 years, we waited for this day," said Erin Gilmour. "DNA didn't just solve the case, it gave us our peace back." This case became one of the most significant milestones in Canada's use of genetic genealogy. It proved that even after 4 decades, science could uncover truths traditional investigation could not. 2 women from very different worlds, one a social worker, one a designer, were linked by the same violent act and ultimately, by the same technology that brought long-delayed justice. As Toronto Police Chief James Raymer said in 2022, "This case reminds us that time changes everything, except the truth." Monica Jack, May 6, 1978. Merritt, British Columbia. Conviction, 2019. It was a quiet spring afternoon in the small town of Merritt, British Columbia, when 12-year-old Monica Jack rode her bicycle along Highway 5A. She was last seen near Nicola Lake, smiling as she pedaled toward home. Then, without warning, she was gone. For her family and her community, the disappearance of a bright, gentle Indigenous girl would become one of Canada's most haunting cold cases, one that took more than 40 years to solve. On May 6, 1978, Monica, a member of the Nlaka'pamux Nation, left home for a short bike ride near the highway. When she didn't return, her mother reported her missing that same evening. The RCMP launched an immediate search, joined by local volunteers who combed the lakeshore and nearby forest. Despite days of effort, no trace of Monica or her bicycle was found. Her disappearance sent waves of fear through Merritt. The idea that a child could vanish in daylight on a familiar road shattered the town's sense of safety. Over the years, tips came and went, but none brought answers. 17 years later, in June 1995, forestry workers discovered partial remains in a remote area near Spias Creek, north of Merritt. Forensic testing confirmed they belonged to Monica Jack. The discovery ended years of uncertainty, but offered no clue to who was responsible. The RCMP reopened the investigation, but time had eroded evidence and memories. Despite renewed interviews and searches, nothing linked anyone directly to the scene. The case once again went cold. Everything changed in 2014 when the RCMP's Historical Homicide Unit used an undercover Mr. Big operation to target a man long suspected in Monica's disappearance. The suspect was Gary Taylor Handlin, a 67-year-old man living quietly in British Columbia. He had a criminal history from the 1970s and had been questioned years earlier, but never charged. During the operation, undercover officers befriended Handlin and recorded him admitting involvement, revealing details only the killer could have known. Those admissions became the central evidence against him. Handlin was arrested in November 2014, and after several pre-trial motions, his trial began in 2018 in the British Columbia Supreme Court. The defense challenged the undercover confession, but the jury rejected that argument. On January 17, 2019, Handlin was convicted of first-degree murder in the killing of Monica Jack and sentenced to life in prison with no chance of parole for 25 years. For Monica's mother, Madeline Jack, who attended nearly every court hearing, it was a moment of long-awaited justice. "I'm relieved," she told reporters. "We finally have justice for Monica." The case of Monica Jack remains one of the most powerful examples of justice delayed but not denied. It is frequently referenced in discussions about missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, MMIWG, a national crisis that has affected communities across Canada. Monica's disappearance predated the public inquiries that would later expose systemic failures in how authorities handled cases involving Indigenous women and girls. Her story stands as both a tragedy and a symbol of resilience, a reminder that even after decades, persistence and modern investigative work can bring long overdue answers. Renee Sweeney, January 27, 1998, Sudbury, Ontario, conviction 2023. It was a freezing January morning in Sudbury when 23-year-old Renee Sweeney unlocked the doors to the video store where she worked part-time. A social work student at Laurentian University, she was known for her warmth and drive, balancing classes with long shifts to pay for school. But by noon that day, January 27, 1998, a customer walked in and made a devastating discovery. Behind the counter, Renee was found lifeless. Police arrived within minutes and confirmed her life had been taken. The attack shocked the quiet northern Ontario city. There was no sign of robbery or forced entry, just confusion, grief, and a mounting sense of fear. Investigators recovered a partial DNA profile from the crime scene, but it didn't match anyone in the newly formed National DNA Databank. Each year, advances in forensics offered new hope. New detectives would reopen the file, test old evidence again, and appeal to the public. But every promising lead fell apart. Composite sketches circulated, tips came in, and hundreds of voluntary DNA samples were collected, all to no avail. For Renee's family, it was an endless cycle, each anniversary a reminder that justice was still out of reach. By 2018, 2 decades had passed. The case had gone cold, but not forgotten. Detectives decided to turn to a new and controversial tool: genetic genealogy. That year, the Greater Sudbury Police Service partnered with the Ontario Centre of Forensic Sciences and specialized genealogical analysts. Using the preserved DNA, they built a profile that could be uploaded to a public genealogy database. The results pointed to distant family connections in northern Ontario. Genealogists spent weeks building family trees, tracing them generation by generation, until they reached one man, Robert Stephen Wright. Wright had been a Laurentian University student in 1998, attending the same campus as Renee. He was living quietly in North Bay, working in the region, and had no criminal record. Undercover surveillance followed. When police obtained a new DNA sample, the match was conclusive. On December 11, 2018, Wright was arrested and charged with second-degree murder in connection with Renee's death. After 20 years, Sudbury finally had a suspect. Court proceedings moved slowly as the defense challenged the genealogy evidence, arguing it was unreliable. But after years of delay, the trial began in early 2023 at Sudbury Superior Court. Jurors heard how preserved DNA, paired with modern technology, had pointed directly to Wright. On March 27, 2023, they returned a unanimous verdict: guilty of second-degree murder. Wright received a life sentence with no parole for 12 years. For Renee's family, the moment was overwhelming. "We can finally breathe," her sister said outside the courthouse. "She'll never be forgotten." For the people of Sudbury, this case became a defining lesson in patience and persistence. It showed that even a small piece of preserved DNA can rewrite decades of uncertainty. 25 years after Renee's life was taken, the case that had haunted northern Ontario was finally closed. A story of loss, science, and justice long delayed, but never denied. Nation River Lady, May 3, 1975. Castleman, Ontario. Solved 2023. On a spring morning in May 1975, a farmer driving along Highway 417 near Castleman, Ontario, noticed something tangled in the reeds of the Nation River. When police arrived, they pulled from the water the body of a woman bound with cords and wrapped in fabric. She had no identification, and investigators couldn't match her to any local missing person report. For decades, she would be known only by a haunting name: the Nation River Lady. The case immediately drew national attention. The woman appeared to be between 25 and 50 years old, well-groomed and dressed in expensive clothing. Her manicured nails and dental work suggested she had come from a comfortable background. Yet no one came forward to claim her, and police found no missing person record that fit her description. The Ontario Provincial Police, OPP, distributed sketches, circulated photos of her jewelry, and even reconstructed her face using early forensic modeling. Nothing worked. Without a name, there could be no motive, and without a motive, there could be no trail. As years turned into decades, her case file grew dusty in the OPP's historical homicide archives. But officers refused to close it. They kept the biological samples carefully preserved, waiting for science to catch up. In 2023, nearly half a century later, that moment finally arrived. The OPP partnered with Othram, a U.S.-based forensic genetics laboratory, to apply investigative genetic genealogy, IgG, to the preserved DNA. Through genealogical mapping, investigators built a family tree that led them to the southern United States. After months of cross-referencing records, they identified the victim as Jewel Lala Langford, a 48-year-old woman from Tennessee who had vanished in the mid-1970s while traveling through Canada. Langford had been a businesswoman and former political aide, known for her elegance and independence. She had left Tennessee for a trip to Montreal and Ottawa, but never returned home. For her surviving relatives, the news, delivered nearly 48 years later, was heartbreaking but brought long-awaited clarity. Once Jewel Langford's identity was confirmed, investigators reviewed old leads tied to her travel records and acquaintances in Canada. That review pointed to Robert Donald Burns, a now 81-year-old man living in Montreal who had known Langford in the 1970s. On October 25, 2023, the OPP arrested Burns and charged him with non-capital murder, marking one of the oldest homicide cases ever advanced through DNA technology in Canadian history. At the press conference, police emphasized that without IgG, the Nation River Lady might never have had her name restored. Burns was taken into custody and is awaiting trial. The case remains before the courts, but the charge itself, nearly 5 decades after the crime, represents a remarkable leap for forensic science. For nearly half a century, the Nation River Lady was an enigma, a symbol of loss without identity. The discovery that she was Jewel Langford gave her a name, a history, and a family that had searched in silence for decades. Her case stands as one of the most extraordinary examples of what modern DNA technology can achieve. It connected a 1970s mystery in rural Ontario to a family more than 1,500 kilometers away, proving that no distance and no passage of time can fully erase the truth. Christine Jessop, October 3, 1984. Queensville, Sunderland, Ontario, solved 2020. It began like an ordinary fall afternoon. A 9-year-old got off the school bus in Queensville, dropped her bag, and planned to meet a friend at the park. She never arrived. 2 months later, on December 31, 1984, Christine Jessop was found in a rural field near Sunderland in Durham region. In a single winter discovery, a quiet community's missing child case turned into a homicide that would haunt Canada for decades. Christine vanished on October 3, 1984, after returning home from school. A massive search followed. Neighbors, officers, and volunteers canvassed the area until her remains were located on New Year's Eve in a farmer's field outside Sunderland, east of her hometown. Toronto police later summarized the early facts publicly. Christine's life had been taken, and key forensic evidence was recovered from the scene. Attention shifted to a next-door neighbor, Guy Paul Morin, who was arrested in 1985. His first trial in 1986 ended in an acquittal, which the Crown successfully appealed. At a 1992 retrial, Morin was convicted of first-degree murder. It would become one of Canada's most prominent wrongful conviction cases. Just days before his appeal was to be heard, new DNA testing in January 1995 conclusively excluded Morin, and he was acquitted. The Ontario government then launched a public inquiry, the Kaufman Commission, to examine investigative errors and systemic problems that contributed to the miscarriage of justice. The inquiry's 1998 report detailed how tunnel vision can distort investigations and set out extensive reforms. Decades later, investigators revisited preserved evidence with investigative genetic genealogy, IgG. By October 2020, Toronto police announced a definitive DNA match to Calvin Hoover, who was 28 years old at the time of the crime. IgG, combining crime scene DNA with public genealogy resources, had finally identified the source profile first recovered in the 1980s. Hoover had died in 2015, meaning no charges could be laid. But the forensic link allowed the service to close the case and publicly name him as the person responsible. Police outlined the timeline and method at an October 15, 2020 news conference. Major outlets reported the confirmation the same day. After 36 years, the Jessop family and Morin finally had the truth. Christine Jessop's case became a Canadian touchstone for the devastation of a child's unsolved homicide, the dangers of tunnel vision, and the power of modern DNA. It drove reforms after the Kaufman Commission and, decades later, demonstrated how IGG can resolve even the most seemingly impossible files. In the end, science both cleared an innocent man and identified the real perpetrator, closing a chapter that had remained open since 1984. Woman in the Well, discovered 2006. Saskatoon, Saskatchewan, identified 2025. In 2006, construction workers in Saskatoon were digging on private property when they uncovered something unexpected, a human skull buried deep within an old, collapsed well. Police arrived and quickly determined that the remains were historic. Forensic experts were called in, and over the following days, they carefully recovered the partial skeleton. There was no clothing, no personal items, and no indication of who the person might have been. Initial analysis suggested that the remains had been underground for generations. The bones showed signs of long-term decomposition, and carbon dating placed the death somewhere in the early 1900s. Investigators concluded that it was not a modern crime scene, but a mystery from another era, one without witnesses, records, or even a name. For nearly 2 decades, the case sat open in Saskatoon police archives under a haunting title, The Woman in the Well. Over the years, forensic anthropologists re-examined the remains several times. Specialists confirmed the individual was a woman likely in her 20s or 30s at the time of death, standing about 5 feet tall. She had been in the well for close to a century, but beyond that, there was little else to go on. Dental comparisons failed to match any known missing person files, and no historical reports from the early 1900s described a woman disappearing in that area. By 2015, with traditional forensics exhausted, the remains were preserved in hopes that emerging DNA methods might someday help identify her. That hope remained dormant until nearly 20 years later, when a new form of genetic technology offered one last chance to solve the mystery. In 2025, investigators turned to investigative genetic genealogy, IGG, the same cutting-edge approach that had solved numerous cold cases across Canada in recent years. Specialists at a forensic laboratory extracted a small DNA sample from the bones and used next-generation sequencing to build a viable profile. The profile was uploaded to genealogical databases to search for distant relatives, many of whom still lived in Western Canada and parts of the United States. After months of tracing family trees and historical census records, analysts identified the woman as Alice Burke Spence, born in 1881 in what was then the Northwest Territories. She had lived in the Saskatoon region during the early 1900s and was believed to have vanished sometime between 1910 and 1912. The identification marked a national milestone, the oldest cold case in Canadian history solved through genetic genealogy. In a press conference held in June 2025, Saskatoon police confirmed the identification publicly. Investigators said there was no evidence of foul play by modern standards, but the finding finally gave Alice Spence an identity after more than a century of silence. Forensic investigators and local historians worked together to locate surviving descendants, and a small memorial ceremony was organized to honor her life. Officers involved in the case described it as a rare opportunity to merge modern science with historical respect. The story of Alice Burke Spence, the woman in the well, is less about crime and more about remembrance. For over 100 years, she existed only as an anonymous set of bones. Now, through the same technology that has reshaped cold case investigations across the world, she has a name, a birth year, and a story that stretches back to the turn of the century. Her identification reminds us that every person, no matter how long forgotten, deserves recognition. Even after a century underground, modern science restored Alice Spence's identity, and with it, her dignity. Pauline Brazeau, July 1976. Calgary, Alberta. Conviction 2025. In the summer of 1976, 24-year-old Pauline Brazeau lived alone in a modest apartment in north-central Calgary. She worked in the city, kept close ties with her family, and was known as quiet and reliable. When she failed to show up for work one morning, co-workers grew concerned. Later that day, police were called to her residence, where they discovered her deceased under suspicious circumstances. Investigators treated the case as a homicide from the beginning. They interviewed neighbors, checked her social circle, and examined potential break-ins in the area, but nothing pointed to a suspect. Forensics in the 1970s were limited to fingerprints, blood typing, and witness recollections, tools that often produced more questions than answers. With no clear lead and no match to any known offender, the case went cold within a few years. By the early 1980s, Pauline's file joined a growing list of unsolved homicides in Calgary. Detectives kept a few biological samples in storage, but at the time, no one could have imagined that those small fragments would one day unlock the truth. Nearly half a century later, in 2022, the Calgary Police Service Cold Case Unit, working with the RCMP Historical Homicide Unit, began reviewing older cases that still contained preserved DNA. Pauline's was one of them. Advances in investigative genetic genealogy, IgG, allowed analysts to work with degraded samples once considered unusable. A trace DNA sample from Pauline's original case was extracted and sequenced at a modern forensic lab. That genetic profile was then compared with entries in genealogical databases used for law enforcement purposes. After months of analysis, a pattern emerged that connected the evidence to a family line in Alberta and Saskatchewan. Building that tree branch by branch, investigators identified one individual who fit every detail: Ronald James Edwards, a then 72-year-old man living in southern Alberta. Detectives quietly collected a new DNA sample from Edwards, and laboratory testing confirmed an exact match to the genetic material preserved from 1976. In July 2023, RCMP and Calgary police officers arrested Edwards and charged him in connection with Pauline Brazeau's death, one of Alberta's oldest unsolved homicide cases to be resolved through DNA technology. Over the next 2 years, the case proceeded through the courts. In early 2025, Edwards entered a guilty plea to manslaughter, acknowledging responsibility for Pauline's death. The plea was accepted, and he received a lengthy custodial sentence. For Pauline's surviving relatives, nieces and nephews who had grown up hearing only fragments of her story, the resolution brought a sense of long-delayed closure. The case of Pauline Brazeau illustrates how persistence and technology can converge to bring long-forgotten files back into focus. What began as a dead end in 1976 was transformed decades later by the smallest piece of preserved evidence. After nearly 50 years, the identification of the person responsible ensured that Pauline's case was no longer just another unsolved name in a file drawer, but a reminder of how far forensic science and determined investigation can reach. Nadine Gurczynski, 1999. Niagara Falls, Ontario. Solved, 2024. In the summer of 1999, 26-year-old Nadine Gurczynski was found deceased in her apartment in Niagara Falls, Ontario. She was young, ambitious, and well known in her community, described by friends as someone with a quiet kindness and a love for music. Police immediately determined her death was the result of foul play. But in those first critical weeks, every lead went nowhere. There were no witnesses, no forced entry, and no clear motive. Investigators gathered what evidence they could, including forensic samples and household items, but DNA technology at the time was still developing. What they recovered wasn't enough to identify anyone with certainty. After months of searching and interviewing, the case stalled. For years, Nadine's name remained on Niagara Regional Police's cold case list. Detectives periodically revisited the file, hoping advances in forensic analysis might reveal something new. Her family never stopped pushing for answers, posting online, speaking with local journalists, and organizing memorials to keep her case from being forgotten. By the 2010s, improved DNA testing had solved other unsolved homicides across Ontario. But Nadine's remained a mystery. The evidence was minimal, and the profile developed from it did not match anyone in Canada's National DNA Databank. Still, investigators preserved every sample and document, waiting for the next scientific breakthrough. That breakthrough finally came in 2024, when the Niagara Regional Police Service partnered with forensic specialists and used investigative genetic genealogy, IgG, to re-examine evidence from Nadine's case. The genetic material recovered years earlier was reprocessed using modern sequencing techniques and uploaded to a genealogical database. From a few distant family matches, analysts began to piece together potential family trees. Months of cross-referencing led investigators to one name, Joseph Raymond Brousseau, a man who had lived in the Niagara region at the time of Nadine's death. When police traced his records, they learned that Brousseau had died years earlier, meaning he would never face trial. But additional DNA confirmation left no doubt. He was the man responsible for taking Nadine's life. In a news conference held in May 2024, Niagara police announced that the case had been officially solved. After 25 years, investigators could finally give Nadine's family the truth they had waited decades to hear. Detective Sergeant Jody Richmond, who led the renewed investigation, called it a testament to perseverance and evolving science. "We never gave up," she said. "Even after decades, the smallest piece of evidence can still speak." For Nadine's relatives, the resolution brought both grief and relief. They expressed gratitude to the detectives who refused to let the file fade and said they finally had a name, something to help them close one of the longest chapters of their lives. The case of Nadine Gurczynski highlights how investigative genetic genealogy continues to rewrite Canada's cold case history. It showed that even when a suspect can no longer stand trial, truth still matters, for the victims, for their families, and for the communities that never stopped asking questions. A single fragment of preserved DNA transformed a 25-year-old mystery into a story of resolution and persistence, ensuring that Nadine's name would be remembered not as another unsolved statistic, but as proof that justice can still be found, even after time has seemingly run out. Decades after these tragedies first unfolded, science finally gave the answers that time could not. Behind every DNA match is more than a name. It's a family finally finding peace, a community reclaiming its sense of closure, and a reminder that no case is ever truly forgotten. Each of these investigations began the same way, with uncertainty and heartbreak, but ended through persistence, patience, and the belief that truth is always worth pursuing. For the detectives who never gave up, and for the families who carried hope across generations, these resolutions are more than headlines. They are moments of justice, long delayed, but never denied. Even after 40 or 50 years, a single preserved fragment of evidence can reopen history and restore someone's dignity. These cases remind us that justice doesn't expire. It waits, quietly, for the right moment to speak. Which of these stories moved you the most? Share your thoughts in the comments. Every story here represents real people who waited a lifetime for answers. And if you believe more forgotten stories deserve to be told, subscribe for more true Canadian crime documentaries and the cases that prove time can hide the truth but never erase it.